July 30th, 1975. Jimmy Hoffa walks into a restaurant parking lot in suburban Detroit for a meeting with two mob bosses. He makes a phone call to his wife at about 12:15 p.m. saying nobody showed up. That was the last time anyone ever hears from him. No body, no arrest, no answers. 50 years later, the FBI still doesn't know where he is. So where the hell is Jimmy Hoffa? Okay, so Jimmy Hoffa. You know the name, obviously. The guy who vanished. The guy they supposedly buried under Giant Stadium, or in a horse farm, or in a New Jersey landfill. Every few years, there's a new documentary, or a new search, or new theory about where his body ended up. But here's what most people actually don't know. Before he became this eternal mystery, Jimmy Hoffa was legitimately one of the most powerful people in America. We're talking about a guy who controlled a union with over 2 million members, a guy who could shut down the entire trucking industry with a phone call, a guy who built the American middle class for people who never went to college. And then the mob killed him. Probably. Almost definitely. But they did it so thoroughly that we still can't find him. Let me back up. James Riddle Hoffa was born on Valentine's Day in 1913 in Brazil, Indiana. His dad was a coal miner who died when Jimmy was 7, leaving the family broke. Hoffa dropped out of school at 14 to work in a Detroit warehouse. By the time he was 20, he'd organized his first strike because he was furious about how he and his coworkers were being treated. This is the 1930s, the Depression. Companies treated workers like crap because there were always 10 desperate people standing in line waiting to take your job if you complained. Hoffa didn't care. He was fearless. He'd pull up next to sleeping truck drivers on the road, wake them up, and give them his pitch about joining the Teamsters. Over and over, relentlessly. In 1933, the Teamsters had 75,000 members. By 1936, they had 170,000. By 1939, they had 420,000. Hoffa was consolidating all these little local trucking unions into one massive national organization. He became national vice president in 1952, general president in 1957. At its peak, the Teamsters had over 2 million workers. His biggest achievement, the National Master Freight Agreement in 1964. This thing covered 400,000 workers across 16,000 trucking companies. People said it was impossible. Hoffa did it anyway. The agreement standardized wages, benefits, pensions, health care. It gave truck drivers real economic power. It lifted millions of families into the middle class. So that's the hero story. The guy who fought for the little guy. The guy union members absolutely loved. Now, here's the other part. To build that kind of power, Hoffa made deals with organized crime. In the 1930s and 40s, if you wanted to organize trucking in Detroit or New York or Chicago, you were going to run into the mob. They controlled the industry. Hoffa didn't just tolerate that relationship, he leaned into it. In the late 1950s, this mobster named Johnny Diogardi set up fake union locals to help Hoffa win the presidency. Totally fraudulent. Paper charters that gave Hoffa extra votes. This is when Robert Kennedy, working as chief counsel for the Senate, started going after Hoffa hard. Kennedy saw Hoffa as absolute evil, a racketeer, a criminal stealing from union members. Hoffa saw Kennedy as a spoiled rich kid with a vendetta. They both hated each other. Blood feud, level hatred. But the real problem, the thing that eventually got Hoffa killed, was the Central States Pension Fund. Hoffa created this fund in 1955 to manage retirement money for the Teamsters members. Billions of dollars. He staffed the board with people who would approve anything he wanted. And then he started making loans to mob guys. Huge loans to build casinos in Las Vegas. Caesar's Palace, the Desert Inn, the Stardust, all built with Teamsters pension money. The mob would skim cash off the top of these casinos, tax-free, and route it back to crime bosses in the Midwest. The pension fund was basically a criminal slush fund. The government eventually caught up with him. Hoffa got convicted in 1964 for jury tampering, conspiracy, mail fraud, wire fraud. 13 years total. He started serving his sentence in March 1967. While he was in prison, he handpicked his successor. Frank Fitzsimmons took over as acting president. Hoffa thought Fitzsimmons was a pushover, a guy that he could control. That was a massive miscalculation. Fitzsimmons liked being president, and the mob liked Fitzsimmons because he was way easier to control than Hoffa ever was. In 1971, President Nixon commuted Hoffa's sentence, but there was a catch. Hoffa could not participate in union activity until 1980. This was almost certainly done at Fitzsimmons' request to keep Hoffa from immediately running for president again. Hoffa was furious. He tried to overturn the restriction. He wanted his union back. He started campaigning anyway. He was planning to publish a book exposing Fitzsimmons for selling out to mobsters. He was going to detail all the shady pension fund loans. And that's when the mob decided he had to go. See, if Hoffa came back and won the presidency, he was going to shut down their access to the pension fund. We're talking about billions of dollars. The mob had a whole financial ecosystem built around that money. Hoffa was threatening to destroy it. There was also a personal element. Anthony Provenzano, this mobster from New Jersey, absolutely hated Hoffa. They'd been imprisoned together at Lewisburg, and whatever happened there created this bitter feud. Provenzano had been getting loans in the pension fund for years. He had every reason to want Hoffa gone. So they set him up. July 30th, 1975, Hoffa leaves his house in Lake Orion at about 1:15 in the afternoon. He stops to visit a friend in Pontiac. Then he drives to the Machus Red Fox restaurant in Bloomfield Township. This was a nice place, fine dining. Hoffa was supposed to meet two people, Anthony Giacalone, a Detroit mob enforcer, and Anthony Provenzano. The story was that this was going to be a peace meeting. The Giacalone brothers had been visiting Hoffa at home, positioning themselves as mediators. Hoffa's son later said that he was convinced the whole thing was a setup from the start. Hoffa arrives at around 2 o'clock. At 2:15, he uses a payphone to call his wife. He tells her nobody showed up for the meeting. That's the last time anyone hears from him. Ever. His car was found abandoned in the parking lot. The FBI found fingerprints on a 7-Up bottle under the front seat. They belonged to a guy named Charles O'Brien, a family friend. This suggests that O'Brien may have driven the car at some point after Hoffa arrived. Maybe O'Brien was the guy who picked Hoffa up, someone Hoffa trusted. The FBI immediately focused on Giacalone and Provenzano. They convened a grand jury. They generated over 16,000 pages of investigative files. They convicted 6 suspects on unrelated charges, but nobody was ever charged with Hoffa's murder. In 1982, Hoffa was declared legally dead. So, what happened to him? Theory 1. Anthony Provenzano ordered the hit. His guy, Salvatore Briguglio, a hitman from New Jersey, carried it out. The FBI's internal memo names Briguglio as being directly involved in the disappearance. There's also Frank Sheeran. You might know him from the movie The Irishman. Sheeran was a mob associate who claimed on his deathbed that he personally shot Hoffa. Federal agents think Sheeran might have been used to get Hoffa into the car because Hoffa trusted him, but that Briguglio was the actual shooter. Theory 2. The Detroit mob, the Tocco Zarelli crime family, did the job. Some federal officials believe the triggerman was Anthony Palazzolo, a Detroit mob guy who died recently. The theory is that Hoffa was driven from the Red Fox parking lot to a house down Telegraph Road where Palazzolo shot him. Either way, the operational details are similar. Someone Hoffa trusted picked him up. O'Brien or Sheeran, probably. They drove him somewhere close by, and then they killed him. Now, here's where it gets really dark. We've never found the body, and we've looked everywhere. In 1989, a hitman named Donald Francos claimed Hoffa was buried under Giant Stadium in New Jersey. This became a huge cultural thing. When they demolished the stadium in 2010, they checked. Nothing there. The FBI searched a horse farm in Michigan in 2006. Nothing. Local police dug up a driveway in Roseville, Michigan in 2012. They tested soil samples at Michigan State University. No signs of human decomposition. Most recently, they focused on a landfill in New Jersey under the Pulaski Skyway. This was called Brother Moscato's dump, run by a crime family soldier. There had been tips going back to 1975 that Hoffa was buried there in a 55-gallon drum. A landfill worker gave a deathbed statement saying Hoffa was 15 feet below the surface. The FBI did a full site survey in 2021. In July 2022, they announced they found nothing of value. So where is he? The most credible theory, the one that actually makes forensic sense, is that they destroyed the body completely. There's an account that says after they killed him, they ran his body through an industrial sausage grinder to break it down. Then they incinerated it at a disposal company in Hamtramck, Michigan. The building allegedly burned down shortly after. Another theory says the body was ground up, shipped to Florida, and dumped into a swamp. If you think about it, this is the only explanation that makes sense. If they'd buried him somewhere, we would probably have found him by now. Modern forensic techniques can find remains decades later, but if they ground him up and incinerated him, there's nothing left to find. The mob knew what they were doing. This was a carefully planned execution designed to make sure Hoffa could never be found. They needed to send a message, but they also needed to make sure there was never enough evidence to prosecute anyone. And it worked. Jimmy Hoffa genuinely changed America. The National Master Freight Agreement, the growth of the Teamsters. Millions of people got good jobs, good wages, good benefits because of what he built. But the same tactics that made him powerful, the same willingness to work with criminals, the same abuse of the pension fund, all of that destroyed him. The mob that helped him rise eventually decided he was too dangerous to keep alive. And now, 50 years later, we remember him for the mystery, not for what he accomplished. We remember the disappearance, the searches, the theories. That's his legacy. A question nobody can answer.